Welcome back to another episode of ShiftED uh, from Learn. My name's Chris, and this is we're on episode, I don't know, about 5 for the new school year, 2023-2024. I'm connecting today through Montreal, kind of a cloudy, chilly fall day. Winter is right around the corner. Um, and I brought Scott DeJong on from Concordia, who's a PhD student, I believe, still, Scott.
Technically, we say candidate, but all the difference means is one more paper to go, which is the dissertation.
Oh, the big one.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
And Paul's Scott, sorry, is a he's been dabbling in game-based and gamification for a long time, and we met last year, and I just really wanted to bring him on the show to kind of talk a little bit about how games can enhance learning in our learners, in our students. So thanks, Scott, for hopping on here and
Yeah,
joining us for a little chat.
absolute pleasure to be here.
Cool. So I always like to kind of like get your kind of your history, your timestamp of how you got to this point in your life. When did games start becoming something of an interest and seeing beyond just playing games yourself, but seeing that connection to what you're doing nowadays? Where did that kind of start bubbling up from?
Yeah, I mean, I always find people's journeys kind of interesting too, because you see like where they were and where they got. And so for me, I mean, games have always been a part of my life, but the turning point I think was when I started realizing that I wanted to go into education. So my undergrad, when you have that I'm from Ontario, so for all the Quebec listeners, I didn't have CEGEP. So when I was in grade 12, I had that choice of like, where am I going to go for my future? And I was like, I mean, education seems like something that I would really like. I like to facilitate, I like to work with people. And so I went and did a teaching degree. And as someone who played games avidly in my life, I couldn't help but notice a lot of ways that games could complement learning environments. How, when students are working on math, they're inherently working on logic puzzles. When students are working on literacy, there's a lot of ways that you can use games or decoding methods to kind of break down phonics. And so from there, it was through the degree, I kind of used assignments and stuff to kind of test the waters and see what was possible, or classroom placements as chances to kind of bring in games into those moments. I also got jobs as a summer counselor, a camp counselor at the time,
Mm-hmm.
which honestly was a great opportunity to talk to kids and be like, what are you playing these days? And how can we turn that into a game? And those processes really helped me realize how games are a big part of both children's lives, but play more generally is a big part of how kids are understanding the world around them. And I mean, we talk about play-based learning, and that kind of fed in one into another. So I pursued a master's that was like, how can we use games to talk about really serious, complex cultural issues? And I started to look at ideas of disinformation, echo chambers, filter bubbles, and I made escape rooms and board games throughout my master's and PhD to kind of talk about those processes with kids or teenagers or undergrads, depending on the game and the audience. And so it's kind of been this weird combining my hobby life with my professional development and my own education, and seeing the two kind of merge. Now I'm in this beautiful spot where I get to do a PhD where I'm making and playing games, and it's kind of
Right.
amazing.
That's cool. And what's your PhD dissertation going to be about? What's the
Yes,
theme?
perhaps that. Yeah. So I was in communication studies here at Concordia University, and my research is looking at disinformation and how we can use games and other educational tools to help children and youth and adults try to understand how disinformation functions, and how they can respond to it. So I look at media literacy and tools that we can use to respond.
Wow, that's fascinating. And one of the questions I always get from teachers, and we're going to get back to that topic because it's a hot topic,
Mhm.
but maybe just kind of a base level of the difference between gamification versus game-based learning. I always get that question: what's the difference? What's your opinion on that? On those two?
Yeah, there's so many terms out there. So I don't like anyone asking a question, but like, what does this mean versus this mean? It's probably someone in a room is like, we have to differentiate the two. But for these two specifically, The difference, in my opinion, is one is where the gameness exists. So game-based learning puts games at the core. You're using the game first, and then you're talking about the game, what the game's doing, and you're letting the actions of the game teach a concept. Whereas gamification is you have something that you're trying to teach, and you use game systems like rewards or points or prizes as ways to kind of encourage engagement and motivation. So, like a good example would be for gamification. Some teachers might be familiar with the tool Prodigy, which is like a math software online that kids can play, and they type in questions to defeat monsters, and it's like, what is 5 + 3? And you put in 8, and then you deal damage to the monster. That is gamification because at the base, it's just a really pretty looking worksheet. It's a worksheet that has all these beautiful creatures and storylines and all these things around it. But at the core, what you're doing is you're just answering the worksheet questions of 5 + 8. You're just doing addition. Whereas game-based learning, there's a game called Math Makers, which is an app on the iPad that instead of kind of telling the kids to input 5 + 3, they use logic puzzles. So there's a character on one end of the screen and they have to get to a goal at the other end of the screen, and kids have to use like fractions to add pieces of wood or cubes or circles to kind of build a path to get their person from point A to point B. And so in that process, the actual game mechanic of get person A to B is teaching the concepts of fractions and other math pieces. Fractions is the most common one that I've looked at there. Whereas in Prodigy, you're just kind of inputting the answer, and all the pretty sparkles and stuff allows you to be engaged. Both have their merit, both have their value, but the way that we design them is very different.
Right, right. And I think those one of those games, the math game, was that's a Quebec game, is it not?
Yeah, it is. I think Prodigy's out of Toronto, but Math Makers is from Yulu Lab, which is a Montreal-based company.
Cool, cool. Yeah, Montreal is kind of becoming a cool hub for game creation.
Yeah, we have quite a game community here in Montreal, both from the commercial side with like the big studios sitting in the city, but also there's a lot of small indie studios who are either education games or education games adjacent.
Right, right. Well, I like your examples. That it makes it clear. Maybe a follow up on that is like, what makes games engaging to kids, to students, in your opinion? Like, what is it?
Yeah,
the mechanics or the visual, or like, what is it about games that draws kids in?
I mean, it's different for every kid. Like some kids will have different reasons why they like to play a game. Like, so I have kids that tell me they love to play Prodigy because there's cute animals in it, right? And they like the fact that they can have this cute animal. For other kids, they actually like that logic side that comes with playing. Like when you're playing a game and you have to solve a puzzle, whether it's like a very apparent puzzle, like the ones we might play with our family on a kitchen table, to something more like, how do I maximize my character so they do the most damage, which is also a different kind of puzzle. Those things can also be hooking for people. What I think games do really well is they build kind of not alternate realities, but kind of alternate spaces where we can explore, we have agency, we have choice, and we can kind of direct our learning. I mean, anyone who's worked with kids who love Minecraft can kind of see that on an exponential level, where Minecraft is just I call it Lego Online, which it isn't for any Minecraft player, and I'm sorry if I insulted anyone. But for those who don't know Minecraft, right, you go into this open world where you can craft all these things, make all these things, and you can use these spaces to really learn a lot, because depending on how we direct them as teachers, kids can engage in them in completely different ways. And it allows for those kids to write what they find interesting into the gameplay space. So what games do, in my opinion, and when they're doing it well, is they're creating what I call agency and flow, which is allowing kids to have a say in their learning or have a say in their interest in what they're doing, and in doing so kind of get engaged in this process that brings them through the learning themes and goals that the game or the teacher you implementing it provide.
Right, right. And is there a given age where bringing game-based learning into the classroom makes more sense than other times? Or is it, I mean, start them whenever that interest is there for them?
Yeah, I mean, I would say kids are playing prior to school, right? I mean, we talk about play-based learning in kindergarten already, and we see it in preschools, and Montessori schools do it a lot, where kids are inherently playful. I argue that adults are inherently playful. We just learn to hide it for social purposes. But kids are inherently playing with the world around them. They're imagining, the lines on the floor that they can't step on because they might, well, the break their mother's back is the
Right.
line, but more like I used to do it of like I fall in the lava or I give the
That's
villain
it.
points when I went through the mall. And so kids are always playing. And so why not engage them in that process? If their mind is already there looking creatively and playfully at the world around them, why don't we create ways to meet them there as opposed to being like, well, let's sit in a desk right now, let's do our worksheet, and let's make sure you understand your addition.
Right.
You don't have to have them sit and do rote in order to do that. You can have them, be creative in that process and let them write that in there. And I know play-based learning can get messy and chaotic, but I
Mhm.
believe firmly that in that mess and in that chaos is when we actually form the most effective learning moments for our futures.
Absolutely. I agree with you too. Like preschool seems, well, in Quebec anyway, we do have, I think in most places around the world, play is, a huge part of those first, 4, 5, 6 year olds'
Mm-hmm.
lives. And then it shuts off, right? It's like, okay, grade one rolls around and it seems like, where did the play go?
Yeah.
Um, what kinds of ways would you recommend for teachers to incorporate games if they're just starting off and they're interested in it, but they're kind of still have that mindset of, oh, games is kind of like playtime and it's not learning time? How do you bridge the gap between games and real authentic learning that could happen in any subject area?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of like teachers who are like, I want to use games that they don't know how, the default approach is to find a Chromebook or a laptop, and then when a student is done their work early, tell them to go load up a browser and play the game.
Right,
And I mean, that's a great start, right? Because at
right,
least they're
right.
coming into the space and it's a reward. But for me, it's about looking at your lessons, looking at what you're trying to teach, and thinking about how that's already kind of playful, how that's already kind of gamey. So
Mm,
if you're teaching math, you're inherently talking about taking quantities and moving them and shifting them. And you don't have to do that by just writing on a worksheet. You can bring those pieces in and kind of make it interactive. I mean, the
mm,
lines between what is play and what is a game in the academic world is constantly debated. And so
right.
for me, I'm like, don't be stingent as a teacher being like, oh, well, is this really a game? If you frame it or you engage it in that kind of narrative playfulness, then it already is a game. So if you're interested in using games, if you're interested in kind of thinking about them, first off, there are a lot of resources online that will tell you of like existing games that are out there. I can't promise that all the games that you find on there are going to be good. There's a
Right.
lot of websites online that have really poor quality games, and there is a bit of like a sifting through the sands of like
Mm,
finding games that are actually going to do well. I
mm,
firmly believe that like those kind of games are best used for that first thing I mentioned, where like you just have them play them at the end because we can't really trust them to do anything, and they're kind of just time filler. The
mm,
games that are the meat, the juice of the classroom, is
mhm,
when you're able to talk with your students to see where their interests are and connect that back to the curriculum through something that's playful. So for
mm,
me, in the work that I've done around language, I've had students where you can connect language to social studies. So we were teaching like the Canadian wars throughout our history, the English and Lower and Upper Canada. And I don't
right.
want to get into the political tensions of how that leads to today, but at the
Right.
time we had like we played it out as a class. Like we took our different kind of settlement groups, and we talked about like what we needed for the war and how we would plan to
Mm,
attack and why we were doing that, resources we need, the time that it would took, and we simulated that model. And that's a lesson that has stuck with me, but also with some of those students for a very long time, because it
mm,
wasn't just sitting and reading about it in a book, it was enacting it through our actions. And while it wasn't like soccer where like the game has an end point of like after 90 minutes we're done and whoever has the most points wins, because at that point there was technically a historical winner. What playing in that space, whether or not there's a solution or an end result, does is allows you as a teacher to be like, okay, so what did we learn here? What wasn't actually quite right? Let's fix the narrative, because obviously a bunch of kids with snowballs isn't actually how it worked. But it brings them into those moments in really engaging and creative ways that helps them stick with it.
mm. I like too how you're saying that you're giving the kids the experience first and then
Mm-hmm.
you talk about it after. Like that there's that structure. I love how that, get them involved with it, get them like having experiences and bringing their lives into it and then reflect on the
Yeah.
learning parts, of um I wanted to come back to this um playing games informs us about disinformation and fake news and like we're kids are bombarded right nowadays with social media and advertisements, and I mean, you name it, it's an ongoing assault.
Yeah.
um and oftentimes we get this feeling that who's raising these kids? How does your games address those kinds of issues that you were mentioning before that you're looking at in your
Yeah, I mean it's a big question, right? And I think
yeah,
it's not just for kids; it's us adults too. And I mean, we
right.
can look at right now with our the amount of misinformation that's flowing about chaotic events like wars or the pandemic
Mm-hmm.
that just happened. And it's how do we break that down and understand it? And what's currently being done, so my research is looking at like what has been done in this space of like educational tools and what's missing. And so what has been done is there are a handful of tools that will teach the skills of fact checking. So like the fact that like when you come across an article, you should double check the source, you should double check the headline to understand that it's preying on your emotion, and teaching kind of those basic skills. And I've, posted some blogs kind of recommending some of the games that I think do that well online. But what I've come to in a lot of the work that I'm doing is that teaching the skills doesn't matter if we don't teach the motivation. So teaching kids or adults how to critically think about the scams that they're seeing or the fake news articles they're seeing. There's a chance that like, especially when it comes to scams, it's definitely more successful because scams are pretty obvious to spot once you know what to look for. But when it comes to like disinformation and fake news, people aren't going to be motivated to double check the facts unless it's either a something outside of what they typically hear about. So like that sounds weird.
Right.
Or B, it's something like personal to them where they're like, I want to make sure that's right before I share it. Like they're in a point of like talking about it. And so what I've been trying to do is use that point of engagement I was just talking about in games where like you have them engage in it first and talk about it second as a way
Mm-hmm.
to make them think about motivations for critically checking their sources. Um, because I think it's great that we can teach fact checking skills, but it's really hard to motivate the actual use of them and recognizing when to use them. And
Right.
so, Media Smarts in Canada has talked about like the need for teaching people to just pause, stop, and reflect. Like we don't even need to fact check. We just need to first just stop and be like, does this make sense? Or like if you're about to share something or post something, be like, I'm now saying that this is true. And so
Mm.
is it actually true? And so
Mm.
how do we create moments to encourage pausing and reflection? And so I've been using games as a way to do that because what games do is they kind of you're playing in this process. You kind of get into the flow of the game where on your turn you do A, B, and C and thing. But if the game all of a sudden has that flow and then breaks it up with something, perhaps like a narrative or a different mechanic or a different player's turn, those are moments when you're asked to sometimes reflect on what you're doing. And so I've been looking at how we can use those parts of games to encourage reflection and then have that translated to how we engage with social media. And so before, when I mentioned you have them play it and then you debrief with them after, I'm
Mm.
making games that are designed to be facilitated in a similar way where you have students play through it. It models social media for them. It models how things end up on their news feeds, but it encourages them to stop, recognize how what they're seeing online impacts the world offline, and then perhaps take that with them moving forward. And this is not like a one solution. I'm not saying that this is
Right.
successful just yet. It's this place that's where the gap is, and that's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to figure out. And so I've designed some prototypes and I'm working on some other projects. But if you are teaching it, that's the thing that I would stress focusing on. If you're
Mm.
teaching disinformation, fake news, dealing with that, yes, make sure they know how to find the right source, but more importantly, make sure they know how to be motivated to actually check.
Right. I love that idea too, because I mean, it sounds very much like informing students about digital citizenship. Where they have to be responsible when they're online because it it is always going to be there. It will follow you.
Exactly.
However you react or respond online. Um, and we've always had kind of like this issue of like who's going to teach this, right? Because it's
Hmm.
not really a sub. I mean, you're going to put it in math or gym or um,
Yeah.
so I find that having it where you can integrate it into many different, because to me it seems like it's a cross curricular
Yeah.
integrating games where it touches on multiple subjects
Hmm.
in one single game. Um,
Exactly.
could you give us some examples too of some of the games that you've been working on that are are propelling this idea forward?
Yeah, I mean, so just to clarify, because there are some games that are like really good at like doing math and language at the same time as playing,
Right,
and those are inherently the games that I'm working on are more on these social issue spaces,
right.
and so while like math skills are involved, I wouldn't necessarily slot it in to teach like grade four math in the same way. But to the point of media literacy and media education, that is across the curriculum.
Mm-hmm,
So perhaps the most prominent game that I've designed, which is for a bit of an older audience, like I typically say 12 and up.
mm-hmm,
It's called Lizards and Lies, and it's a game about conspiracy theory and how it moves through social media. What the game does is allows players to either be the ones who are spreading social media or to be the ones who are stopping the spread of social media.
mm-hmm.
Well, not sorry, of social media, of conspiratorial content on social
Right.
media.
Okay.
And so you have this back and forth with players are understanding like how hard it is to actually stop people from lying because you can't, right? Like when someone it's so much easier to just post something false online than it is to post something true. And through playing that, those who are trying to stop it are realizing that they can just keep posting their lies and it's like an endless thing. And those who are posting the lies realize how ineffective some of the tools that we have are out there. And it leads to some really powerful conversations about like, well, what could we do to stymie their efforts? What could we
Right.
do to slow them down?
Mm,
And we get to conversations of education and policy, especially when I run it with older teen or undergrad audiences.
right.
For those who are teaching perhaps slightly younger audiences, a lot of the fake news media literacy games that are out there are really language heavy. Like they really
Mm,
do ask that the players can read. And so if you
mm-hmm,
were to run it, I would suggest running it where you're kind of reading the story for the players and having your students kind of make those choices. So there's a game that just came out called Cat Park. It came out last November. So I guess it's not that new anymore. It's almost a year old now. But it's about a cat park opening in a town and how social media is going crazy about this cat park. And some people want it and some people don't want it. And then you find out it's like, oh, spoiler alert, you find out it's like corporate interests trying to manipulate hate towards the cat park so it doesn't happen so they can build a like a housing structure or something on it.
right. Yeah.
And so it's a really nice model where it's not just reading a story. There's actually points where the players can make fake news articles. They can kind of see how when they talk to one group of people, it can be, kind of proliferated further.
Mm,
And so I haven't made that game. I'm just aware of it because I've studied the game and I've looked at its effectiveness.
sounds interesting.
But
Yeah.
it's a digital tool and it's playable in about 10 to 15 minutes, which is lovely. For me, I'm turning and looking at analog. I'm looking at board games. I'm looking at the physical because
Right.
kids now, honestly, a lot of them have a lot of digital tools already that they're using,
Mm-hmm.
but understanding how these systems work, board games and physical tools are really good at because they let you pick up the pieces, they let you move those pieces, they let you understand why the system's working because you actually have to do the system. When you play a video game, it's all behind the code, it's all behind the screen. When
Right.
you're playing a board game, you're responsible for the system and yourself.
Mm,
Plus, it encourages a lot more conversation than just staring at a computer screen. That isn't to say they both don't have merit and benefits, but just as an educator, make sure that you're not just doing all digital or all analog. Do a nice mix.
right. That's a great tip. So, kind of coming to a close here, Scott, what are some of your recommendations for teachers if they have this interest or this spark or I'm curious? What are some of your recommendations or advice that you would give to a teacher that is interested in either integrating more board games, having kids create board games, online games? Like, what are some of your tips that you would offer up or advice to teachers?
Yeah. I mean, so first things first, the core of play, the core of games is to be creative and to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And so don't be afraid to try to run your own little version of a game, whether you made it yourself or you found something online. Because even in that failure, like even if it doesn't work out, now I'm talking like the game itself doesn't work out, not like the class itself has a behavioral problem and then the game doesn't work, but like an actual, the
Right.
game doesn't pan out as you desired it to.
Mm-hmm.
That is a key learning moment for both yourself, but also the students of like, this game was supposed to do this, but it didn't. Why do you think it didn't do that? Right. And you can break that down with them. So first is like, don't be afraid to fail and don't be afraid to try. Like just grabbing a game and throwing it in there. That's step one to incorporating games in the classroom. If you want some more help with that process, there are groups that there's like all aboard games, I think they're called in Quebec, that will actually go into schools and run board games in schools.
Cool.
There are also there are people who are making and designing these games who are actively trying to fix the large amount of not great educational games that are out there. And so if you reach out to them, whether it's me or other academics or educators who are in these spaces, I'm sure there's tons of recommendations for you. I mean, if you're a fan of Dungeons and Dragons, there's a whole educational wing now for introducing Dungeons and Dragons into the classroom. And there's steps and processes to encourage that. And so,
Right.
step one, be creative and be open to failure. Step two, take a look around and see what's already being done. We don't
Hmm.
need to reinvent the wheel every single time. Well, I do
Hmm.
think that you should reinvent parts of it for your students specifically.
Yeah.
There's no shame in using what's already out there, right? Especially because I'm sure as a teacher, they're overworked and underpaid, and therefore they don't have the time to spend hours and upon hours trying to improve their lessons. So those are the two big ones.
Hmm.
And then the third one is, meet your students halfway. If your students are already playing certain games, whether it's Fortnite or Minecraft or I think those are the big ones right now in schools, but I
Yep.
mean, there's a handful of other ones that are
Sure.
out there. Talk to them about what they're playing and see how what they're already playing fits with what's already being taught. Games inherently are
Mm.
asking us to do systems thinking. They're inherently asking us to be able to read and write and engage in various different literacies and competencies. See what those games are already teaching your students and then see how you can expand them further. And I'm not just saying make a worksheet and slap a Fortnite figure on it so that it's fun and cool. I'm saying talk to them about what they're doing in Fortnite and see about how the skills they're talking about, so spatial awareness in Fortnite, because they have to build walls and structures,
Right.
how that applies to perhaps what you're teaching in geometry or
Mm.
your math courses as well. So those are
Excellent.
kind of my
Wow.
three key points that I would say for getting started.
That's amazing. And you made me think of something as well, that games, kids never worry about failing. They don't care. They'll just restart again. And it gives them more and multiple opportunities to try something and to
Yeah.
learn from it. And I think that one key also in our schools, failure should be seen as as you're learning, that it
Yeah.
is propelling you forward, and it should be like, okay, let's try it again, let's try it again. I'm always amazed at how kids can see video games and how they don't transfer that approach to
Hmm.
school.
But we can be
More.
that bridge, Like the
Yes.
jump isn't that far, and I
Sure.
encourage you to kind of let them talk about it, let them write about it, and let them share that with you, and then see how you can take it even further. But also to the point on failure, I think across the school system, but also across the games, like the educational games world, we don't
Right.
think about failure enough. And I encourage you not to fail your students, but to encourage them to fail and
Yeah.
learn from that failure to try again.
Absolutely. Because they know it. I mean, I talked to some kids on Monday. I was like, what happens when we make a mistake? And they know they learn from mistakes, right? So
Yeah.
that awareness is there. It's just kind of, as you said, bridging that gap a little bit
Mhm.
more.
And research shows that you learn more when you make mistakes than when you succeed. Because when you succeed, you just reinforce what you already know.
Right.
Like if multiple choice quizzes are a really good example of this. Of like, unless you show people what they got wrong in multiple choice, they just leave it thinking that they knew everything, or like the questions they didn't know, they're just like, I just didn't know that one. Whereas when you fail, you consistently think about what you messed up. Which again, in the multiple choice, if there's a question you came across you didn't know the answer to, at least for me, I'm always like talking to my friends after, like, what'd you get for number like 45? I had no idea, because it sticks with you, right? Or like at the end of the day, when you fail in a social conversation, you might just like go to bed and then think about how you messed up that moment in your life and how you'll improve it again in the future, right?
Absolutely.
It encourages that, and so sit in that and work with that and use that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the pursuit of learning. I mean, what did I not get right about it? I need to know so that I can move forward. Right. I mean, most
Exactly.
games allow you to fail, but then succeed. And you have this idea that you're propelling yourself forward so that you're
Exactly.
gaining more and more knowledge. And well, Scott, this has been fascinating. I mean, I
Yeah.
really appreciate your words, and I'm gonna throw me a bunch of the links that you mentioned, and I'll put them in the descriptor in the
Yeah, I'll
podcast.
throw you some of the games we talked about for sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, and good luck with your dissertation.
Thank
And
you.
we'll
Thanks for
talk to
being
you
here. It was a
soon.
pleasure. Anytime.
Yeah, it was awesome. Great conversation.
Wonderful.